Welcome to our final panel of the convening, which is our philanthropy panel. And I will introduce our guests one by one, starting with Angela Sanchez. She's the program officer with the ECMC Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Angela. Hello. Next, we have Gabriella Gomez. She is the Deputy Director of Postsecondary Policy and Advocacy with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Gabriella. Welcome. And last but certainly not least, please join me in welcoming Scott Jenkins, Strategy Director with the Lumina Foundation. Welcome, Scott. So if we could begin by hearing a little bit about your role in the foundation that you serve, as well as the type of priorities that your foundation has in terms of education in general and higher education more specifically. We can begin here. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm Angela Sanchez again. I'm the Program Officer for College Success at ECMC Foundation. And collectively, our mission across the foundation is to secure post-secondary opportunities for our students from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds. This includes low income, first in your family to attain a post-secondary education, as well as more broadly students of color. And in thinking about this vision for higher education, really we want to see that there is equity in opportunity. I think what we hear a lot about is equity and opportunity. You really can't pursue a successful post-secondary education unless there is equitable options for you, whether you are a return adult learner or a first-time freshman or a transfer student, but being able to climb that pathway into achieving a four-year or a certificate or a credential is really the goal that we're seeing going forward.
Thank you so much. Please.
Mm-hmm. So I want to associate myself with the equity and opportunity and the work that we are evolving and moving towards as well. So at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we have both programmatic work, policy and advocacy work. I work on the policy and advocacy side, very closely aligned with our programmatic colleagues, Patrick Methvin, who was going to be here today, who is our director on post-secondary. We work very closely on the work that they are doing to incentivize the supports and needs of institutions and systems. And we work collaboratively with our colleagues on that side to say, okay, what do we learn from that and what do we need to advance in the policy and advocacy space? So big picture, we are trying to do the to and through, and so that we're talking about completion as we have been with you all for many years, but completion to what end? And I was just speaking with Scott about this, that we are starting to talk about this employment and the pipeline to employment and what is the end result. And so while we are focused on the degrees and credentials, we are starting to think about what's the value? What is an institution providing and what is a student receiving, an individual as a result of that? This is also part of an evolution in the foundation to work hand in glove with our K-12 program colleagues, because as many of you know, we have different parts of the foundation, which I always say is like curses and blessings, because we've been doing a lot of siloed work, and now we are really working together in that effort, and I attribute it to the leadership of individuals like Patrick, who really is trying to bridge those gaps. So that's a snapshot of the work we're doing.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Yolanda. And first of all, just congratulations on your new role. Very excited for you to be here. Glad to know that we're the panel that's going to keep you from that delayed flight at O'Hare. Excellent. So I asked I'm Scott Jenkins. I'm the strategy director for state policy at Lumina Foundation. And I asked my comms team, I've always been frustrated that we never kind of had the 3-minute speech of, who is Lumina, what is our vision, what is our mission? And so they finally produced one. And so some of this may sound like the Quicks talk that happens at the end of the Cialis commercial, but I do at least want to try this out with you all and see what you think. So Lumina is the nation's largest private foundation dedicated solely to ensuring people get education and training after high school. The kind of learning that is essential for each of us as individuals and for the nation. Our mission is urgent and it affects everyone. We're guided by one ambitious and audacious and ridiculous national goal. By 2025, 60% of working age people in the United States must have a college degree, certificate, industry certification, or other credential of value beyond the GED or high school diploma. Why? Because these credentials are vital to success in today's world. For most of the 20th century, high school education was Americans' ticket to the middle class, but that started changing in the 1970s as the knowledge economy began to emerge. The education and skills that propelled people into the middle class and beyond 50 years ago just don't exist today. Nearly all new jobs now require some education beyond high school, and most require a bachelor's degree. The rise of artificial intelligence, advances in technology, and globalization mean that the old days are not coming back. Simply put, those who stop learning at high school risk being left behind. But it's not just about jobs. The learning that comes through higher education enriches our lives. It opens doors to options, choices, and opportunity. It strengthens our families. It makes us more informed, which is essential to a healthy and thriving democracy. It enhances our local, our state, and our national economy. Reaching that 60% goal will not be easy today. Just under half of Americans have that quality higher education. And our current system is out of step with those needs. Unfortunately, most of the costs are skyrocketing. And secondly, there is a real trend among our policymakers that higher education is a private as opposed to a public good. And the system often excludes people of color and people from low-income households. So we're working to revitalize higher education to be affordable, student-centered, accessible, and to produce fair results, especially among African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. We put a special focus on serving low-income families, people of color, immigrants, and all who want to learn and thrive, because reaching them will make us all stronger. Even as we help colleges and universities educate more students without increasing tuition and related expenses, we also involve employers, community leaders, community groups, advocacy organizations, philanthropies, and governments at all levels to rethink how we can do this job better and advance the learning and skills to all citizens and immigrants thriving to join them. My colleagues at Lumina and I feel strongly that there is no higher mission than this, helping Americans learn and live their best lives. And as I said at the start, this mission has never been more urgent. We can't do this without you, and that is why I'm delighted to be here today.
I like it.
Thanks.
Scott, with that 60% goal in mind, what specific investment strategies are you all utilizing in order to reach the goal?
Did you want to stick with me?
Yeah.
So Lumina, we work at least the state policy level, which is what the area where I work, is that we tend to work at what I'll call the ecosystem level. And what I mean by that is that we work at the big levers of public policy, so issues around encouraging states to set a similar goal as Lumina has, that is measurable. It sets high standards. It addresses equity gaps, and it's codified in a way that guides policy and budget decisions. We do a lot of investments at Lumina, both to third-party intermediaries, to places like Complete College America, but also to direct resources to states and institutions to support activities that help a state to reach its attainment goal. We work a lot in strategic finance. We work a lot in advocating for funding formulas that drive resources towards outcomes as opposed to enrollment-based or cost-plus type or prior year funding type of formulas. Then we have a state policy agenda that kind of drives that activity. Finally, we believe that states are all on their own and represent themselves on a spectrum of where they are in public policy, and trying to encourage them to implement those types of policies that we know that are successful and intentional around closing equity gaps. I've been doing higher education and K-12 policy for nearly 30 years now, and I firmly believe that unless systems, organizations, institutions are created with equity at the center,
Yes.
then by and large, in the end, the results result in unequitable results. And that is why, as we try and revitalize this work and lead this work, we're really trying to put the types of students that we need to serve at the center of
Yes.
that work and going forward. And that's basically how we strategize our resources and strategize our funding towards institutions and organizations and states that can do that work.
Thank you. And Gabby, you talked about helping students go to and through college and the pipeline methodology. Can you talk a little bit about the Gates Foundation's investment strategy toward that end?
Absolutely. There's similarities and differences with foundations. We were just talking about at the end of the year, the crunch. But taking a little bit of a step back, because the foundation operates with both early learning, K-12, post-secondary, and now more potentially into the employment and workforce space, and mobility. You may have heard last year we talked about launching a mobility and poverty strategy. The beauty of what we get to do in the policy and advocacy side is to take a step back, look at our program colleagues and the work that they're doing in the institutional structures and say, what are the connections that we can do? So our approach in the policy and advocacy space is really place-based. So we've learned a lot, especially from our colleagues who have been doing this for quite some time in a state level, but really looking holistically at what is happening in a particular place, whether it be state, national, and connecting the dots. And so we do get that opportunity to talk about transitions and really integrate the work that's happening through pre-K, K-12, and post-secondary, and chief among those things, data. We were finding early on that the work of our program colleagues was super siloed, that we had K-12, post-secondary, our pre-K folks all needing different data, and it's like, hey, guess what? We could talk to each other and we can develop a policy agenda that helps weave that together. So that's process, and so then we invest against that approach. So sometimes it will be in national organizations, sometimes it'll be state organizations, third parties, and that's generally what we're trying to drive towards, but we're also trying to create this balance out there because in the post-secondary space, the advocacy infrastructure is in need of nurturing and support and growth because we'll, and Scott can speak to this too, in different states there are different levels of maturity of what is in existence for post-secondary advocacy. And so once that starts happening, you start to see that balance with institutions who feel like, someone's looking at me, do we like that? So I think that's an important, healthy balance that we want to make sure is in the environment because the foundation doesn't want to be doing this forever. We need to make sure that that infrastructure is out there in the environments to make that balance happen.
Yes. And Angela, you talked about equity being really central to ECMC's work. So as you all make strategic investments, how do you look at a proposal or an initiative or something that someone is offering and trying to evaluate how far it is along the equity continuum and if it's something worth making an investment in?
Sure. Let me start though with a little bit of a focus on structure as well. So, and I'm sorry if I missed this point earlier, but the end goal for us is also to see that not only do all learners reach their fullest potential, but more specifically also that they're able to secure a family-sustaining wage. So similar to what my colleagues have said earlier as well, is that there is a return on investment for their time spent in cultivating their post-secondary education further. That being said, we approach the strategy through two portfolios. So one being career readiness. They focus on returning adult learners who have a high school degree or equivalent and need a certificate or credential in order to advance to the next skill set and ultimately pay scale in furthering their own careers as well. They have a special emphasis on adults who are about 27 and up, as well as single mothers and anti-recidivism efforts. The portfolio that I'm on is College Success, and our focus is bachelor degree attainment. Understanding that our students begin at both 4 and 2 years, we look at transfer pathways as well as first-time freshmen beginning at four-year institutions. As a national funder, we're agnostic with regards to geography, so even though we're based in Los Angeles, California, we will fund anywhere from the East Coast to the Midwest. We don't have a specific geography that we are intent upon. It's kind of fitting that this year should end for me with a December in Chicago, considering that I began January in Alaska. So So that being said, though, returning to your question, Yolanda, about equity. So speaking for the College Success Portfolio, we have attention to, one, our populations of students, and then two, the levers on which we're trying to reach them. So the primary one being, the larger one, I should say, being institutional change and organizational reform, or systemic reform and organizational change. And how do institutions collaborate? This is what had CCA catch our eye the first time they came across our radar, was the way that it goes into specific states and communities and works with their two-year, four-year institutions as well as their industrial partners too, to really build economic hubs of creativity and seeing that more of their students are able to graduate. Mm-hmm. And on the flip side of that, understand that institutional change takes time. We also have attention to direct service programs. So whether that's a bottom line or another organization, a local CBO that provides students with anything from a resource that they might engage with, whether that's a nudge app or mm-hmm. an advisor or a type of resource that overall impacts a student's likelihood of persistence and overall graduation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And now, Gabby, you talked a lot about you all being, in some respects, place-based, right? But also the data. And I know we had a presentation from the National Student Clearinghouse about the Postsecondary Data Partnership. And so I'm rolling that all into one question to ask. As you look at having relationships with grantees, does the place-based and having relationships with other entities within Gates make a difference? So if you already have an investment on the K through 12 side, if there's an investment on the early childhood side, does that matter in terms of a relationship with the grantees or beginning a relationship? And then in terms of data sharing, how can we leverage those sorts of relationships so that there's a data sharing agreement amongst institutions and potentially with Gates as well?
So those are good questions. So let me remember. So let me start with the data. So our investment is our investment, again, on the programmatic side with NSC is a big exploration of how do we try to create the infrastructure and the needs out there for data that we would like to understand and know to see if we're incentivizing the change that our theory is that we will hopefully provide. So it's providing supports to us and the institutions that we are working with. We said, hey, what if we gave you support to offer this up to others and have a relationship where you NSC are providing a service, and then NSC will have information that we can all understand and share and see impact. We're going towards that because there is a current ban on student unit record information. So we're trying to figure out how do we get the information that we need, not so that we're saying, oh, X person, did this when they were in kindergarten and now we're predicting where they're going to go. We're really genuinely trying to figure out what is needed and what can we do at a particular institution or for populations of students to drive and incentivize the change. So it's a hope and desire that will grow. So mm-hmm. I think to the extent that individuals can give good feedback to NSC to encourage the deliberate interaction with it, I think it helps us. And then it also helps for us in the policy and advocacy space, because I like to be able to point to things and say, look, sky didn't fall, things are still okay. Privacy and security is obviously a big part of the data yes. conversation, so we want to make sure that continues to happen. But it's interesting that you ask about the different aspects at the foundation, because when the NSC investment was coming along, I remember our post-secondary colleagues said, oh, we just learned that the K-12 folks used to have an NSC one, so let's talk to them and learn about that. So there's a lot more of that happening in connection, so that we can actually say, hey, yeah, it does make sense to connect the information and have the information talk to each other yes. in a way that impacts not just our post-secondary work, but we're embarking on networks for school improvement in the K-12 space. How can we have that be something that connects at a state level?
Yes. And Scott, is it important at Lumina for you all to have a relationship with the grantees? How does a prospective grantee gain a relationship with your foundation? And then what does an ideal relationship look like once it's established?
So I have a long seasoned history in philanthropy. I've been doing this for 3 years now. Prior to this, I was a policy, political, vote counting operative doing K-12 and higher education policy. I always say, I've learned through my time at Lumina that we don't make grants to organizations, we make grants to people.
Yeah.
And people in the organization is just the superstructure to support that person's work.
Yes.
And that relationship is developed through the scope of work that we determine for a particular grant, and how well the individual in the organization then deliver on that. We tend to be very metrics driven at Lumina Foundation, so with whether it's state policy and moving elements of our state policy agenda, or if it's our institutional work and increasing credential completion. We look to organizations and people that can really help move the needle. 2025 is our deadline for our goal, so we're running up pretty close to that. So we're not doing a lot of work. If you're doing pre-K work, go talk to Gabby and others. But what I will say is that the relationship matters from the standpoint of it's not that we're friends. Yes, we might be friendly, but it's that your work is actually getting us closer to the goal,
Yes.
and to the extent that you can support that mission and our mission aligns with your mission, then it's a great long-term relationship that we can do. Lumina does not typically do kind of big multi-year engagements. We do a lot of annual work, and then we evaluate that, and then we'll step up and say, okay, we want to do more continuing work. So recently we 2 years ago did a grant with the National Skills Coalition to start looking at, back to the data point, is how many states are actually integrating non-degree credentials, certifications, certificates, and other types of third-party credentials into their state longitudinal data system, and did a big national survey on that, and really realized, to no one's surprise, that no one's really doing that you don't have those, and let alone being connected to actually a unit record. And they did a really great job on it, but what they pointed to in that work was, we're really not having as strong a conversation about quality. And what is the state funding and policy decisions made around what we invest in, around those credentials on a qualitative measure, and then how do they break down by race and ethnicity and other types of things. And so we're going to continue that work because it opened up a whole new realm of things that we could think up at the state level, to think about, can we get states to start thinking about quality definitions around those non-degree credentials and supporting that kind of work.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you the same question, Angela, about relationships with grantees, but I want to frame it too, because part of what we've heard from our Alliance members is sometimes feeling as if grant makers are so far away from them, they don't necessarily know how to access the grant makers or what's the best path, and they don't want to come off as too friendly, as if they're just trying to be cozy up, but they want to make outreach, they want to make overtures, and sometimes aren't sure. And so the question that we've gotten is how to strike a balance between, do you just send information cold, do you try to walk up to an individual after a convening like this, so how best to approach the foundation or the individual. So in terms of relationships with your grantees or prospective grantees, how do you view it?
I would like to think that we're a fairly approachable foundation, and that's a couple of things. One, I'm happy to speak to anyone after this panel today, but two, we also have an open LOI process. So if you were to go on our website and go to our section on strategic grant making, one, you'll see at the bottom of, after the description about our strategy, about how to reach out to us, complete the LOI intake form. It used to be that we would get either mail letters of inquiries or emails directly to us. Now we have an intake form that specifically asks, please detail your program here, talk about sustainability. We want to make sure that we're accessible that way. And while we will reach out to other partners or existing relationships we may have with other organizations, there is a significant percentage of LOI that have come into us and then have advanced through our proposal process as well. So to kind of complete that thought, it's that we do want to hear about what's going out there in the field, and we do also rely upon these cold inquiries for you to tell us what you need. We believe that our job as a funder is to be both proactive of what's going on in the field, but also responsive to those who are living the day-to-day, who are the boots-on-the-ground experts, and who can inform us about their local and regional experiences that are going on for them right now in the moment. In terms of having relationships with our existing grantees, I think that the foundation of any relationship is trust. And to build trust, you need to be transparent as well, and you need to communicate fairly frequently. I'm saying that for the professional context of this. And that in having that relationship with a grantee, we're going to communicate what our strategies are. If we are moving in a different direction, for instance, college success used to be college readiness and retention. We no longer do the college access side of things because that has a lot of significant volume around it, and college persistence needs as much support as it can get. So when we had college access grantees, we made them aware of this shift early on. We want to make sure that there were no surprises, that they knew that there was this change coming. We also asked that if any other ideas or programs were going to be pitched our way, that these ideas aren't coming out because they're seeking further dollars. In other words, we don't want an organization that's inventing a new strategy or inventing a new program just to appeal to the direction that our foundation is going in. That's not sustainable. We want to make sure that we are offering the support necessary in order to build out the sustainability of a program or a project, whether that's an evaluation, whether that's the operating support, whether that's the overall strategy that is going into making sure that the idea being proposed is part and parcel of that organization, and that we are being the best possible partner that we can be.
You talked about your shift, Angela, from college readiness and access to success. So I can imagine a number of those partners who were in the access or readiness space might have transitioned into thought partners with you. How appropriate or how accessible is it to have the grant maker become a thought partner with you as an organization?
I think, personally speaking, I think it's very appropriate because we're able to offer the national scope of things. We also have the connections with other organizations that are already in the college success space, the persistence space. So we can also offer some of the information that we're gaining from them about what's going on, where do we see the direction of the field, what support's already in place, and for an access organization, what do their students need to be prepared for as well. I would also add that some of our grantees, for instance, Bottom Line, Bright Prospect in Southern California, already had a college persistence aspect of their program in place. So there was no shakeup when it says when we said we're only going to be funding this specific dynamic of your program now going forward. For other grant candidates and grantees, some were thinking, well, what if we do want to push into the college persistence space? Is that okay? Will you continue to support us? And in some cases, we also said, here's some funding for a planning grant. Please think through your strategy. We want to make sure that this is the best decision for your organization. The grantee, in one case, had the year for this planning grant and realized that they were more effective as a college access organization. When they came to us at the end of their period and said, we decided we're going to stay in this space, we want to let them know that that they had our full support in that, and that they could come back to us at any time that they wanted to discuss either what options are available to their students, what have we noticed in the field going forward, if there's any other information that we can share. I think being an effective thought partner just means being accessible and being open. We're a small staff, and we are fairly busy trying to make sure that we're covering all of our bases, but that should definitely never come at the expense of being able to share our ideas and the information and knowledge that we're gaining from this work that we're doing. Otherwise, what is the purpose of our work if we can't be part of the process that shares it as well? I think I'll cap off also with just saying that right now we're also trying to see what are some of the specific dynamics of the work that our grantees in the college success space our college success space as it relates to direct service programs are doing. So we're now entering into the first stage of an evaluation. We're pulling a cohort of grantees to look at how they use mentorship to encourage college persistence for their students, and what impact as a mentor, whether it's a near peer, AmeriCorps, a Vista member, or a faculty mentor. What does that mean for the way that a student interacts with them, how frequently and how accessible that mentor is, and what best mix of these programs leads to a student's overall persistence or likelihood of persistence toward graduation. When we get the results back from that, that's something that we want to widely disseminate and make sure we're sharing not just with our college persistence partners, but also those who are working in the access space too.
Thank you. And Gabby, I know as a point of personal privilege, from when I've worked with the Gates Foundation in the past, we've had the opportunity to, having led a scholarship foundation, work with the Hispanic Scholarship Fund, Gates Millennium Foundation, Gates Millennium Scholars, to jointly look at our work together and feed that back to the Gates Foundation, because we had all been funded. So we view that as a sort of thought partnership in terms of being able to feed back data and longitudinal studies about our alumni, et cetera. So I know it happens, but can you talk a little bit about how it happens and how you're able to connect this thought partnership with your grantees?
Well, I think we appreciate it and need to do more and do it better. I think an effort to do that is the way that we are structured, is to try to say, hey, are there opportunities for us to bring folks together, or for you to invite us to particular meetings to just understand or listen and learn? Because that's part of the thing, is we're disconnected, or at least I am more disconnected from the work I'm not actually physically making in the investments, but managing the program officers who are doing it. So it's super important that we provide the time, energy, and effort for that, because some of it is like, who is the person that we need to bring over from the K-12 side to actually help think this through? Yep. Is one of the advantages that we've seen in this. So, or even amongst funders, the more that we can be connecting and talking is super, super important. Early on, and when you came to Lumina, Scott, we got folks together and just said, hey, let's just share who's doing what, so we can just update each other. Because sometimes we don't take our own breath and say, oh, right, you're there too. We'll run into each other at conferences and we'll say, oh, I've got to talk to you about this. But even like on your NSC, or the National Skills Coalition, I wrote a note about that because we just started investing in them. So those kinds of things where we can share amongst ourselves to just say, hey, first of all, let's learn from each other. Let's make sure I don't fund the same thing that you're funding, so that and then let me share with others of how can we then build it so that we're actually moving the needle. But I super, super appreciate when folks bring me, hey, I just have this idea. I'm not sure, like, does it even have any legs? What else should I be thinking of? And half the time it is something that we should be thinking of, and there's constraints one way or another. Or the other half is, hey, actually I heard X entity is doing this and they're actually better positioned to help you. Or internally, let me connect you to another colleague who's thinking about this. Or my staff is not the right place to do that. So I think we're trying to do that a lot better, and part of that is just making sure that we carve out the right time to do that.
Thank you, and I'm glad you brought up the point about connecting the dots and referring people, because Scott, I was going to ask on the thought partnership piece. Also, I know a number of the philanthropic entities are thinking less about giving individually and more about giving broadly, so that there's more of a collective impact. So partnership is central to that. Can you talk a little bit about thought partnership, as well as partnership in the broader sense in terms of investment strategies as well?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit about, I think, why I fit in fairly well with how Lumina operates is Lumina's what I would call a philanthropy that has muddy boots. We're really, we try and spend a lot of time on the ground working with states and working with institutions and leaders and things like that. So we do, so we just finished up a month or so ago what we called an annual policy retreat with state policy leaders, similar to CCA, where you bring a team. We set it up purely as a retreat, where we brought in, usually had the SHIO or the governor's office as the lead, and then they had up to 6 people that they brought in to do that. And we structured it expressly to started with a survey at the beginning. What do you want to talk about? What do you want to learn about? And then set up panels around that. And from all the participants, we had a moderator that would either be, an expert, a subject matter expert, or someone from Lumina that was leading that work. But the panel was made up of all the participants. Yes. So you had a governor's staffer, you had a lieutenant governor, you had a SHIO or someone that was doing the work, and then focused a lot on their individual team time so that they could go back and work amongst themselves and share among that. So to Gabby's point about the ability to pull together convenings like this and others where people can work together and share ideas, yes. We think the best way you kind of can grow good ideas is to plagiarize from your neighbor. That's how good policy is made. And I think that from our perspective, one of our key strands of our work is how do we facilitate that? How do we make those kind of thought partnership and convening things happen? The other part of that about the thought partnership is making a clear determination, and Jamie Marasotis, our president, says, let's lead, follow, or get out of the way. Mm-hmm. What is it that what is Lumina's value proposition to the field and to philanthropy mean? And in yes. a lot of cases for us, that really means focusing and asking the question around equity. And then secondly, when other people are really leading on this, if there's work that's going on with data and things like that Gates is leading, how can we follow? How can we be supportive of that? How can we fill in those gaps? And then in getting out of the way, things that we know that we don't want to be in, the spaces that we don't want to play in, that yields the field to other people who are much more committed to that kind of mission and work and things like that. I think it's given us at the foundation a little bit more clear direction about what is success. Yes. And when we work with our grantees and folks that in the states that are implementing this work, what looks like success for them and sharing those ideas and those things.
Perfect. We have about 30 minutes left, and so far the questions that I've been asking have really been an amalgamation of questions that we've heard from Alliance members throughout the last several days, and then some that were sent ahead of time. I should advise you that all of this will be streaming on our website, and so if there are folks who weren't able to make it or had to catch a flight, please advise them that they can revisit this panel on our website, and also we will be repurposing this panel for other information on our platform as well. But I would like to open it up now to those of you that are here so that you can ask questions, because this panel is really for the Alliance members so that you can get your questions answered. So if we have any questions from the audience, we'd like to receive those now. There's got to be some inquisitive. Larry, please.
When you're, a general question, when you're setting up to fund the project, have you agreed ahead of time on the accountability and metrics that you would like to see out there?
I can jump in on that one.
Go ahead.
Yes. So the question was, in case anyone else couldn't hear, when one of our foundations decides to fund a project, are we already agreed upon the metrics and expectations? Is that right? So for our foundation, and I should actually also shelve this response underneath the relationships with grantees point, or candidates in this case. We enter a conversation with the grant candidate several months before we bring it to our board. So please also, if you're going to reach out to me or to ECMC Foundation in general, please don't request anything to be funded within the next month or 2 months or by the next academic semester. We will probably love your idea, but we will cry because we cannot get out the door that quickly. And so when we first make contact, we usually ask for, if we have an LOI and we like the concept that's being presented, we'll ask for a more detailed concept paper. This might include general metrics as well as a budget and a timeline, a more detailed budget. And then from there, we'll review it. We'll go back and forth with the grantee on either specifics or also any areas that we either cannot or do not fund. And from there, by the time that we have a solid concept paper, I would say that's been about maybe 2 months at maximum, because by then we have a strong sense of We know what the candidate is attempting to do. We know what their general broader goals are. And around that time, we will invite them for a full proposal. And that will be brought to our next board meeting. Our board meets quarterly, so January, April, July, and October. During that full proposal process, we have a section for each year of the grant duration, and that includes metrics that are specific to that year of the grant period. So there's a long-winded answer to say that yes, and we do also get very specific with metrics for each year that the grant is in place.
Yes, thank you. We have another question. Oh, sure, sorry. Gabby?
Sorry.
Oh,
Speak loudly and let's see. No.
testing.
Okay, maybe it's better. Okay.
There you go.
The one thing I would just say for, and I don't know if this is across the board, but the challenge on general operating grants is, especially in the policy advocacy space where you want some nimbleness for windows of opportunity or issues that you didn't anticipate, trying to make sure that you build in the information that you need so that I can go back to my boss and say, no, it really was a good investment. So how do we're still wrestling with how to juggle that, but similar process that as we get grants, there's a general sense of like, what are we gonna look towards measuring? And then we have a measurement team that's really trying to get more granular and better about it, because those of you who are in the policy and advocacy space and how you measure that impact is also something that we're working and evolving and learning from our other colleagues on that. As impatient optimists, they like to say at the Gates Foundation, we're trying to really push to show that impact, but I find that the general operating grant, which we want to do, is hampered by the fact that we then have to figure out how do we develop these metrics on that.
Scott, did you want to add anything for that?
Just a quick observation is that a lot of our work right now, because of the time sensitivity around the goal, is that we are funding much more in the way of action over research, scale over pilot, and that kind of mindset of the work. We do have, and we do really look at couching things in is this building awareness? Is this adoption of things? Is this implementation? And how does it work either at the institutional level, the system level, the state level, the national level? And so we do try and build in those sorts of kind of metrics as part of our work.
Thank you.
So the question I have is in relation to the longevity of these investments. The work that we're actually undertaking is intense, and they have been an issue for decades, right? So they are very entrenched problems. The funding that we get often is relatively short-term in comparison to the actual problem we're trying to solve. What kinds of criteria do you put to make a deeper investment or a bigger investment? What could foundations do to align together to be able to make a significant $multi-million, tens of millions of dollars into a particular region to see that change over a 5-10 year time period? Because we haven't really tried that component. We've like foundations and folks come in, they start it, there's a seed funding component, but it doesn't go much further, and the institutional systems never really quite change. And now we're talking about true systems changes all the way across every single sector, and maintaining that as a single institution of higher education is almost next to impossible. So what could foundations do to play a role in developing a platform, if you will, for us to be able to engage in those longer investments?
I think don't all jump in. I'll try to channel Patrick Methvin, who that's really a question for him, because you're talking about true investments for institutions who are trying to make change. You're like, hey, I've raised my hand, I want to do it, we're all on board, but I can't be doing this sort of like day to day, month to month. How can we make sure that there's actual long-term support? And, you know, I think that Patrick would say there is a desire to move in that direction. You know, that we have had generations and iterations of the work that we've been doing, completion by design, now our frontier set, and now in the post-secondary space saying, hey, once we have a group of institutions that want to do change, how do we provide the supports out there through different solutions, through different networks, through different hubs and channel partners? How do we build that ecosystem infrastructure? I'm sure we stole that from you guys, but how do we make sure that that's in place so that when we do put investments in institutions, you know where to go? Because one of the things that we've been hearing from institutions is like, we want to do that, but where do we go? How do we get it? And then how do we keep the sustained investment to incentivize you to want to keep doing it? So I think that's the aspiration, to keep wanting to go in that direction. There are no promises, because we're a little schizophrenic in how we're thinking it's short-term, long-term, medium-term. And then from the policy and advocacy perspective, which is dwarfs in terms of investments are not the same level of investments as a programmatic, because that's everything inside the building really takes a lot of energy and effort, but everything outside of it, once we know what good looks like, then we can start talking to the policymakers and create that enabling environment for it to continue to sustain, so that then you get supports outside for the change that you are doing internally.
Yeah. And someone back home is going to clobber me for saying this. But I would also say that this is an opportunity for you to push back on the funder and say, whom else should we be talking to? Who's another funder or foundation that you think would be interested in this work? Because we have a network and knowledge base too, and speaking for ECMC Foundation, we're on the lower end of mid-size. It would become a resource game for us to try to make a significantly longer term investment. For us, a long-term investment right now is approximately 3 years and maybe 5 years, but that wouldn't necessarily span out to the same amount of funding that could be done in about 3. We are not in the position to fund multi-million for a single collaboration on our own. However, we have participated in funder collaboratives. Tackling Transfer is one that's being carried out by a collaboration of ECMC Foundation, Joyce Foundation, Gates, I think you're on that, and Kresge as well. And so those, all 4 of us have committed to that, to the support of transfer pathways within 3 different states. That includes Texas, Virginia, and Minnesota. And in each of those states, while we're national funders that are supporting this initial work, there's also an encouragement and understanding between the funder collaborative and each of the organizations that there's also going to be a push to find local funders as well. Yeah. So be sure to draw upon local networks who can also support the sustainability and the continued work around this, where the national funders may taper off.
Yes, Scott.
So Lumina Foundation, the corpus of the foundation is about $1.3 billion. When you compare that to what the annual spend on even a relatively small state on what their higher education system is, or K-12 system, it had funded for about half a year. Illinois spends $4 billion a year on higher education. What we have typically tried to do is to move the systems forward so that activities and student success-centered strategies actually help to recruit or generate more resources for institutions and systems that are actually moving in that direction and supporting that student population. So smaller amounts of money to incentivize good behavior, incentivize good funding formulas at the state level that drive dollars to those institutions that are serving the most underserved student populations, we think provides a much more robust revenue stream long term to keep the initiatives that you all believe are working in place, and to provide more kind of political and community and state cultural support for those types of programs, so that the real money in the system, state and federal dollars, can be really leveraged by good practice and good policy and budget decisions. But that's not to say that we don't think about kind of the long-term implications of that. We always ask within our grant applications, what's the sustainability of this model over time? And I think it behooves you all to think, what does that really mean? Does that mean that at the end of this 3-year grant or 2-year grant, that a miracle must occur either with state funding or with another grantor or a high net worth individual that comes forward to support it? Or as part of the work that you're doing, is part of it actually messaging, communications, understanding, what your ROI or what your benefit to the broader community is, to gain that impact? We're starting to see those even kind of unique investments. Recently, Nashville State is working with the mayor's office in Nashville to provide an influx of new dollars to support Tennessee Reconnect work, to support Tennessee Promise work, and make sure that the supports are there for both human resources but also financial resources to support students that get into a bind. And so what we have typically done is that providing that seed money in the most appropriate ways hopefully builds the momentum to keep these initiatives rolling.
Thank you. We have another question.
Hi, I should know the answer to this question, but honestly, until this moment, you have all seemed so out of reach for our tiny little institution. So I'm very grateful to be here today and to hear from each of you. Do you fund small, ruralish campuses where the numbers of people who would be impacted are quite small, particularly compared to a suburban or an urban or metropolitan area, but for whom your hopefully smaller dollar input would have a profound impact in that region, county area of support or delivery?
So to reiterate what Scott said a little while ago was that we do want to see scale over pilot. So for ECMC, it would be more of an interest in who are your collaborators, whether they are other institutions, or what is the work that's being done in your given institution where others might learn from it too. We have a similar position around research, for instance. While we want to see that there are new findings being done or that there is further data that's coming to the surface, what are you going to do with it? Mm-hmm. And what are the dissemination pathways available? Who else will benefit from the work that is being done in a given locale of interest? So to kind of encapsulate that, who else are your partners? What are your other avenues of influence as well?
Any other thoughts on that?
So I would, again, channeling our program colleagues, I would say that the selection process for how our post-secondary colleagues went about looking at who should the frontier set be is really based on population, who's in and who are you serving. So trying to figure out the Pell Grant population, first generation, students of color, mixed with the leadership. So there was a formula that they, at one point, I think I understood and knew, but, and also if you are in a place where there is opportunity for the change in the environment, so to Scott's point of the long-term sustainability is not our providing the support, but getting others to say, hey, look, this is good. Let's make sure that we drive public dollars towards good and outcomes. So the quick answer is that it's driven by an analysis and formula. We have some smaller community colleges that are, I guess we would say, are more rural than urban that are part of our portfolio. But so I don't think it rules it out. We do focus on the public systems because that is where we are trying to go to scale in the post-secondary side. So that's been a choice that we have made outside of looking at HBCUs where there are some private entities that are part of that, but that's a very specific, unique population that we're trying to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
We have done some smaller grant initiatives. We did a racial justice and equity grant program about a year ago after Charlottesville happened, and that was a national. It wasn't. It was $25,000, $50,000 depending on it, but it was. It wasn't based on size of the institution. We actually funded some really small institutions that were Native American institutions, which were some fascinating ideas. But to points that my colleagues have made, the ability to kind of join together in systems or join together with partners to share that type of thing, but it's difficult in a lot of cases at the national level to narrow down that closely.
And I just thought of a good concrete example from our own portfolio. So we're supporting Triton College here in Cook County, actually, and they were supporting their Triumph program, which I cannot name the full acronym off the top of my head right this second, but the focus is on matching young men of color with faculty mentors, and having faculty mentors who are able to guide them through their 2 years at Triton or longer, and onto their transfer pathway and successfully transfer into a four-year university. Now, this isn't the one program that Triton is going to keep to itself, though. What we funded is their collaboration with 3 HSIs that are nearby community colleges as well, and how are they now bringing their men of color at their institutions to also have faculty mentors, or for some cases also just other outside professional mentors. We don't need to get into I'm sure most of this audience is aware of the racial disparities in terms of finding men of color in higher academia. It's a longer process that we're also pushing forward on as well. But finding that they have professional mentors who are also able to guide their students through the 2-year to 4-year pathway as well. So actually on that note, also attention to equity. One of the reasons we're also funding young men of color programs is because we have noticed that many of our direct service programs are overwhelmingly young women. And while we want to encourage women to go to college and pursue post-secondary education as well, that doesn't mean you can't also make more space at the table, and that you also shouldn't be reaching out to your young men of color programs too. So in doing that, I would say, again, consider who are your other partners, what are the avenues for influence, what is the intent on equity?
Thank you. I think we have time for about one more question, please.
Thank you. My name is Henry Fernandez. I work with CCA, and I am wondering if you could provide your thoughts on risks and also lessons learned by the foundation. So in creating a vision for post-secondary education, essentially the foundations have put a stake on the ground, but there are many stakeholders that vary tremendously, from libertarians to socialists to Republicans, Democrats, people who believe higher education should be about workforce preparedness, others who believe that it should prepare folks for the liberal arts, and who should be driving change. Is it foundations, or should it be governors or policyholders? So what are the risks in creating your vision, and how do you how has philanthropy learned from past initiatives like Common Core and others what lessons learned have philanthropy learned in creating these national initiatives and vision?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I need someone to repeat that question, because for the sound for me, I just could not catch that.
I think what he was asking was who should be driving change in higher education, because there's so many stakeholders. You take a risk of alienating, whether it's a political party or a particular group, if you're saying that higher education change should be driven by the foundation sector, if it's nonprofits, if it's states, if it's federal, who do you think should be driving that?
And if we've learned anything, I think in the process, like our process, or out in the world, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, go for it. A couple of things in terms of learning, and I think what I'm trying to make sure that we do is trying to say, okay, there are things that didn't work, and that's okay. So, and this isn't in the category of it didn't work, but our completion by design early on, there was, and again, this is on the program side, but there was a realization of we were picking up data in different forms and different metrics, and we weren't able to say apples to apples. And we shouldn't do that if it's a 2-year institution, 4-year state. Like, we should make sure that it's within, you know, that comparison group. But we were realizing that we didn't really get the data that we needed, and so we said, oops, with this next generation, let's learn from that, still use the data that we have, but then build on that and say, this is what we know that we need to do moving forward. So I think for ourselves and learning about our own process and what we should be doing to actually help leave that mark. But let me put my other hat on in terms of impact, and since looking at the theme for your conference, my experience has been in public service and working in on Capitol Hill and in the administration and doing policy from that perspective, mostly federal. And while foundations could and should play a role to put ideas out there and to help provide the support for another voice, the importance is what you are doing, and the importance is trying to make sure that we get the information out to those that can have the long-lasting impact. So going back to making sure that policymakers have the right information, that they are the ones that are incentivizing, so that we get to that point. So I think philanthropy is one of the players, but we're all implicated in that, even from like using my hat as just like a taxpayer and a citizen who wants to make sure that good things happen in the world. Like that, my hat in that role, I feel like, is a part of what I need to contribute outside of my work, just generally. So I think everybody has a role, and I think every segment has a role in making sure that we get towards that. So I wouldn't say it's one or the other. I think it's all. And in terms of the political question, many of us lived in a time period where education was not political, right, where we had, like, this was the place where you could just talk and we could really talk about policies. It's less and less that, but we still want to make sure that the ideas are out there and that we have the right conversations of like, okay, if we're talking about free college, for what, to whom, and how? Right. Because if the data doesn't show that it's actually helping the students that we care about, then it doesn't matter what fancy name you put on it. Whether it's free college, debt-free, we want to just make sure that we're talking about the goal. So I think if we all agree on what the goal is, how we get there, there's flexibility of how we get there. And I'm happy for everybody to take a victory lap on it, because at the end of the day, as long as we're helping the students that we care about, that's our joy and end result.
Gabby, I love the way you say, and maybe it's to Henry's point, the students we care about. And it's not the students that just the Gates Foundation or Lumina Foundation or ECMC cares about. It's the students that typically have not been cared about.
Yes.
It's the students that, when you're in California, 60% of whites, 62% of Asians have a post-secondary credential. 17 to 18% of blacks and Hispanics have a credential. Those are the students we care about. We at Lumina, and we say this very profoundly, at least in my mind, we do not have a white student strategy. We have a student strategy around those students who typically are underserved, and that states and institutions need to revitalize what they do to be able to serve those students in a better way. Right. And we're open to all those options of what helps serve those students better, but the proof is in the credential of getting to them to that point.
And I would echo that, the statement, both statements actually. One, we're all taxpayers. This should be higher education reform, post-secondary education reform. Everyone has a stake and a say in it. Most of all the students who are going through it. If you alienate or offend someone, I just do want to point out that for a very long time, higher education was not meant to serve students like me. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Higher education was not meant to serve anyone who was black, brown, or female, or low income, or from another marginalized identity. And in saying that, the environment around education has always been political. So if you end up stepping on someone's toes and trying to do the right and equitable thing, sorry, not sorry, but, and so in doing that, I just want to say though that everyone has a say in this. Foundations, like I said, we want to be partners. We want to make sure that we're doing right by our grantees. And in turn, we want to see that the institutions, the CBOs who also help support the institutions that their students are at, are doing good by their students. We want to see that however you define student, as a returning learner, as someone who is getting a short-term certificate or credential, as someone who's going in for the long haul of a bachelor degree or an associate's, that you are seeing them and you're seeing the whole swath of identities that incorporates. So whether you're in the legislature, in philanthropy, or at an institution, there's a lot of opportunity to be involved and get your hands dirty.
Here, here.
This is a perfect point to end on, and I would just like to please join me in thanking Angela Sanchez with the ECMC Foundation, Gabby Gomez with the Gates Foundation, and Scott Jenkins with the Lumina Foundation for all of their insights. Thank you so much.